Hello there, and welcome to the latest Bristol University Press webinar, this one on digital media, technology, and the future of politics post-COVID-19. My name is Martin Parker. I'm Professor in the School of Management at the University of Bristol and lead for the Inclusive Economy Initiative. I'm also one of the editors of the Bristol University Press series, Organisations and Activism, that two of the books that we'll be talking about today are in. We've got four speakers who are going to be entertaining us today. Unfortunately, each of them only has 7 minutes, so I'm going to be a ruthless chair. So apologies to the audience if you're enjoying it, and apologies to the speakers, but I'm just going to be unpleasant. So we've got Micky Lee, who's Professor of Media Studies at Suffolk University in Boston. Scott Timcke, I'm not sure if I should have asked you how your name was pronounced, Scott. Is Timcke reasonably?
Yeah, that's close enough. It's Timcke, but it all works.
Okay, that's fine. Scott Timcke studies the politics of race, class, and social inequality as they're mediated by digital infrastructures and has joint positions at Johannesburg and Leeds. Peter Bloom, who's Professor of Management at the University of Essex, and Thomas Swann, who's a lecturer in political theory at Loughborough University. So really pleased that you could all make it, and there's obvious cross-fertilization between the various themes in your books. In terms of housekeeping, if participants could type questions in the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen, and I'll put them to the participants towards the end of the session. Any technical issues, use the chat. Somebody's monitoring that. We've got closed captions enabled on the webinar. There's a button at the bottom of your screen, CC Live Transcript. Please use this to show or hide text as you prefer. Details of how to order any one of the four books at 50% discount will be available here too. Use the code digital50 at checkout, and recording of the webinar will be available after the event. So thanks very much. Let's, without further ado, crack on. So our first victim is Micky Lee, Professor of Media Studies. Micky, you have your 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. So hello from Boston. Just to let everyone know, we're actually having a thunderstorm. So in case the entertaining show stops somewhere, yeah. Okay.
This could end with a bang, Micky.
Well, let's hope so. I'm going to kind of relate the book to the Tokyo Olympics. So our book look at media technologies and how they blur work and play in East Asia. So as we all know, the Tokyo Olympics 2020 was the first ever game that did not have a public audience. And, for journalists, athletes, volunteers alike, they were, bussed in designated vehicles from one venue to another. They were not allowed to sightsee. And local residents, they actually did not really want the Olympics to happen because, of the fear of COVID infection. Now, despite all this, the Olympics is actually extremely alive and active and interesting on social media. One of the reasons is because this was the first Olympics that athletes were allowed to post their own social media post. So TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, they all became channels in which that, some people, enjoy the Olympics. So some became instant stars. So for instance, on the right-hand side here, the stars are actually the, fingernails of Sunini. And on the left-hand side here, I know, he's already sort of a household name in Britain, but not so much out of the country. But, the fact that, Tom Daley was leading, during the Olympic, became an international sensation. Some athletes also use social media for causes that they believe in, such as gay rights, and this is a very heartwarming image that during the last game in women's basketball, Sue Bird actually kissed her wife on live television. So in the US, some of the Olympian, if they, went back to college, they could actually cash in for the first time. So in the past, they either decided to not go to college or they decided to go professional. But, this was the first year that they could be, college athletes and also, to, get sponsorship. So on my screen, you will see two basketball players. They're not Olympians, but they definitely use social media to make a point that they are here it for the money. Now, what does all that mean? So it was an interesting game in a way that the human body embodies the virus because the virus transmits through human contact. So restraining human movement around the globe and also in a city has been used as a way to contain the virus. On the other hand, if we think about the Tokyo Olympics, there was definitely more freedom for athletes and fans that like to make and share meanings. And also there are much more opportunities to make money because, now you are drawing people in, not only because of your athletics abilities, but also because of your images. So this is, the central question we ask in our book. So we want to understand the blurry boundary between work and play. Through media technologies, we can basically use three approaches. So on the top right, we ask questions from a political economic perspective. We want to look at questions such as sponsorship, endorsement, deals, advertisement, broadcasting rights about the game. On your top left, we can ask questions from a cultural study perspective, such as, who owns the bodies and also the meanings of the athlete. And lastly, where we can ask questions from a social and technology, study standpoint. So this was the first game that people would watch on social media opposed to on a television set. So what does the game mean when you can watch bits and pieces of it in 1 minute, 30 seconds, or you can pick and choose, the athlete that you actually want to watch. So I'm way below my 7 minutes, but I'm going to stop to keep it short and sweet. So thanks, everyone.
That's marvelous. You surprised me there, Micky. I was assuming I was going to have to make everybody abbreviate what they were talking about, but thank you very much. That was really stimulating and opens up all sorts of ideas. Let's pass on next then to Scott Timcke, who's going to tell us why algorithms are the end of politics in no more than 7 minutes. Thanks, Scott.
Oh, great. I always love a challenge. We can not only talk about how politics is foreclosed, but how our voices are foreclosed. But no worry, I'm not criticizing you in that respect. I want to talk today about the factors that motivated algorithms and politics and sort of what's coming next in my research agenda. My work to date has mostly been about investigating the ongoing dynamics of capital and constraint and how these things characterize American life. And specifically, I'm interested in the security state's encroachment on digital and civil liberties, giving attention to how the state has a historical impulse to weaponize communication technologies. And this sort of forms part of what I call the operation of digital coercion. And this sort of helps preserve an oppressive labor regime that comes with sort of American capitalism. This regime has long institutional antecedents in genocide, enslavements, dispossession, but has now added mechanisms like dragnet digital surveillance, drone and cyber warfare, and protracted conflicts abroad. And one can see the securitization dynamics in the United States domestically as well. Sort of the protests by Black Lives Matter and other organizations against police brutality demonstrate, pushback towards, the real militarized policing of the most vulnerable, and sort of, pushback against data profiling and the like. Algorithms and the end of politics expands upon those themes, but also adds sort of new areas like how social inequalities in the late 20th century and early 21st century have been echoed, amplified, or introduced by algorithmic life. My approach to this topic is through the lens of politics, datafication, and the social question. As I understand it, datafication is a process that converts human practices into computational artifacts. It transforms human life into quantifiable bits ripe for profit-seeking activities. And ultimately, this shores up unfreedom and class rule in the contemporary United States. We see this in its value struggles, that capitalism has a code that constitutes society, shaping the character of politics, society, and everything else. When adhering to this code, datafication replaces the social question with social problems. Whereas social problems presume a degree of reasonable reconciliation through measurement and management, the social question is much more fundamental. It talks about modernity and the consequences of commodification, and how commodification shapes social relationships, the institutions that manage and organize and set in motion social relationships, and the current history of the political economy that organizes all of that. And to me, the social question is very much set aside in capitalist politics. And the thing that I deeply worry about when it comes to algorithmic capitalism is how that question will forever be beyond the realm of being opened up for exploration. So there may just be technocratic management about efficiency and effectivity around the current agenda, but very little opportunity to question that agenda at all. So let me provide a concrete example, sort of using Uber's business practices in the United States. While relying upon US government-funded GPS systems, when courts ruled that Uber must comply with national labor laws around employment rights and duties for their drivers in 2019, the company threatens to suspend operations in California. Effectively, it's a capital strike. Furthermore, they created an amplified and deceptive ballot initiative for the California 2020 election cycle that would suspend employment rights for gig economy workers. Through leveraging their wealth and power and using surrogates in the media and politics, Uber, Lyft, and other sort of gig economy employers spent upwards of $200 million to help Proposition 22. That was a particular proposition at hand. It was the most expensive ballot measure in California history, and ultimately it was successful. The result is that a single economic sector has effectively rewritten labor law at their discretion. And this is sort of telling about the coming recalibration of the burdens of risk between capital and labor. And in sort of my estimation, I think it's likely that labor will lose more ground and will be relegated to permanent precarity. Ultimately, all workers sit in this precarious position, but that this precarity is going to be even more intensified. Effectively, what I'm trying to sort of claim over here is the exercise of venture capital is undermining the quality of democracy. And this sort of brings me to my next project, and where I'm sort of trying to take the themes and topics in the research agenda that I'm speaking about today, and we'll speak about in the question time, sort of forward. My next case study is looking at how platform lending apps, and cell phone account in Africa may ultimately perpetuate neocolonial tendencies within the relations between the North and the South, of course, helped with Southern mediators too. I'm interested in how fintech, is seen and is proposed as to be this magnificent savior for the continent, allowing more financial inclusivity, allowing more people to become banked, allowing more people to become involved in market transactions or formal market transactions, but how ultimately this may set them up on a debt treadmill one of the things about lending apps, and we'll just cover it very, very quickly over here, is that they allow loans to be advanced even in very small nominal amounts, but the repayment rates, the terms of repayment rates are so atrocious, and sometimes the interest rates could be 400% annualized, which very much puts people who are in precarious positions, and particularly the African working class, on their treadmill, ensuring that whatever work they do, they're now systematically or structurally working simply to pay loans set in motion by venture capitalists in Silicon Valley or Paris or the like. So I'm very wary of financial inclusion for all, what that may mean, and the type of technological machinery that is set in motion and ultimately is celebrated as something that is good in and of itself for itself. So to end, and I get a pause over here, the thing that I'm most concerned about going forward is the rise of a digital debit-credit divide as these things map to north-south relations and the type of intermediaries that play a role in sustaining those divisions. Thank you. I'm going to pause over there and hand off to the next person.
That's great. Thank you very much, Scott. That was again really interesting and opens up all sorts of questions which we can return to. If people want questions, could they stick something in the chat, and that will get fed through to us. The next person in the 7 minutes of spotlight is Peter Bloom, who's going to tell us about Guerrilla Democracy, which is a book I'm really pleased to say was published in a series that I edit on organizations and activism. So Pete, all yours.
Oh, thank you, Martin. And I feel a bit embarrassed because I'm not sure that, I mean, those were two really fantastic presentations. So now I am in the inevitable position of trying to follow up from, quite detailed analysis. But I wanted to just first present the main thesis of our book, which is really around questions of mobile power and how that relates to a radical politics of guerrilla democracy. And then, if I can, in 7 minutes, I want to relate that then to questions of what this means for COVID-19 and the types of possibilities and alternatives that can occur afterwards. I think a clear starting place from our book, and I should say I wrote it with two fantastic co-authors, Owain Smolovic-Jones and Jamie Woodcock, was that we had a real concern with contemporary understandings of power, ones that I think can be very still rooted in modernist notions of stagnant forms of homogeneous domination. And this simply was neither empirically true, so to speak, nor did it really make strong theoretical sense. And what we meant by that was the fact that empirically, we were increasingly seeing that there was a viral character to power, right? That ideas spread very quickly, and that certain dominant values could be easily made adaptable to local context. Theoretically, what we really wanted to focus on was this idea how this represented a fundamental feature of power, which was the fact that it was insatiable, right? That at its core, and ironically its strength, was its flexibility and adaptability. Its ability to, as we use in the kind of metaphorical terms, and I think it was unfortunately quite timely, it's able to adapt itself and transform a quote unquote host context, right? And you could see this on all sorts of different ways. So marketization is a really interesting example in the sense that on the one hand, it has very strong core principles of exploitation and surplus value and often wage labor that it's trying to gain through profit. On the other, it can assert itself in any number of different national and institutional contexts, right? And it can do so in ways that are both transformative of them, but also are transformed by them. So we wanted to ask a really important question of, to what extent can we also start beginning to employ mobile power for a more revolutionary politics? And I think this was a key part then of what we were trying to say is, how do we make revolution and alternatives to capitalism as insatiable, innovative, flexible, and adaptable as what you see capitalism itself to be? So that led us to Guerrilla Democracy. And we called it Guerrilla Democracy because we were very interested in three aspects of this. One, we were interested in the ways in which periphery movements can combine in order to transform fundamentally and overthrow what seems to be hegemonic core regimes and values. And I think you see this a lot now in discourse of localities versus centralism, etc. The second is we were quite interested in the ways in which very particularized localized experiments could be upscaled, right? And so there was a kind of idea of globalism. And we wanted to better understand how that connection was made. And I think the third part is that we wanted to view things in terms of processes of what we call rematerialization and resituating. How could local communities, so to speak, or local institutions or local movements rematerialize their reality? So quite honestly, transform the material social relations, and how could that be a process then for a form of what we call contagious revolutionary reimagining? So researching the very conditions of the political. And I think Scott's point that he made earlier was very well taken, which is that algorithm governance has all sorts of problemizations in the Foucauldian sense, but these problemizations proliferate precisely because of the fact that they avoid the more fundamental social question of what's actually at stake in this process, right? So resituating is about actually bringing to the fore, again, this social question through of transforming a materialist relations. So I thought with the pandemic, some things that I could begin to speak about, and I know I have about 3 minutes, so I apologize, is the fact that, one, I think that there's been massive dislocations, and that's clear. And you can look at Martin's recent edited collective book on this, but it affects everything from work to play to capitalism itself. I think, though, there's also a lot of dangers. I think the big movement around this discourse of life ignores a lot of biopower, right? So actually, the question of let's have an economy that's based on health and life has not necessarily always led to good results and is easily exploitable. And again, I mean, I think Scott's point, it's work that I'm doing right now on financial inclusion is a great example of this, right? And when they have had embedded subjects, what are the first thing that places like Kanza and MGISA did? They started noting, oh, this can help your health, right? I would say, though, that what you can see is the movement between ideas of mutual aid towards leading to really radical experimentations with things like potentials for user-led democratic forms of planned economies, which I think are things that really challenge and bring again to the fore what is the point of an economy, what are our material relations, and what's that relationship between what I think some have called placeless and place-based radicalism. I think the other really important ideas here that we can see around a kind of things is this idea of cooperative advantage and commons values, right? So we talk about a common sense, which is about how do you bring in ideas of commons ownership and cooperation and turn them into actual processes of local rematerialization so that you could then have forms of global resituating. And I think these are really important questions that we're trying to engage with, but it's really about, if you look at and if you work with at a local level, so to speak, increasingly you see questions of cooperative advantage for no other reason than capitalism is broken, it's not working. So the question is, how do you not just upscale this, but how do you do so in a way that's global, insatiable, and radically transformative?
Lovely. That was a really nice way to finish. And I think that idea about the social question, which Scott raised, is one that we'll almost certainly come back to in questions. So if you do have questions, stick them in the Q&A, please. So last up then, Thomas Swann from Loughborough University, the second book from our lovely Organisations Activism series, and his book was called Anarchists, Cybernetics. Thomas.
Thank you.
You just switched your camera off, Thomas.
Yeah, it's gone off by itself. Sorry.
Somebody's tracking this conversation.
Right, no idea what's happening. So I'm going to have to start without the camera. I don't know what's happening.
Okay, we can still hear you just fine.
Yeah, oh, it's come back
again.
on there, yeah. Yeah, okay, brilliant. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how we've sort of shifted from kind of optimism around social media and digital technologies to pessimism, and a sort of quite pessimistic period we're in now. So if we look back a decade, in the midst of the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, some of us might be old enough to remember those. Social media was seen as a democratizing force. If we fast forward to the present day, instead of enabling radically democratic forms of organization, one of the dominant political stories of social media that I think sort of encapsulates how social media functions politically at the moment is the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So social media has gone from seemingly having the potential to revolutionize politics to the opposite, with political elites and established power structures reinforced by the use of big data. What I want to suggest today is that there's something about the mechanics of how we interact on social media and the way information is curated for us by complex algorithms, the kind of thing Scott was mentioning, that actually turns our interactions into a form of a very kind of augmented reality game. So augmented reality games are games in which the real world is filtered through a game platform, and our interactions with the world are channeled through the architecture of the game. Pokemon Go is a sort of famous example of this kind of game, where players had to travel around the real world to collect and train their in-game characters, and where through their phone screens, the visible reality of the world was augmented by superimposing characters onto it. The QAnon conspiracy theory that centered around Trump and led to the storming of the US Capitol in January can also be seen as an application of this sort of approach to politics. So what QAnon did was take the reality of US politics and augment it with a conspiracy theory about an elite paedophile ring involving the Clintons. Trump was seen as the hero in this narrative, trying to take them down from the inside, and his tweets and the tweets of others were analysed to find hidden meaning within them. So while much of the QAnon activities took place on message boards away from mainstream social media platforms, I think there is something in how individual behaviour is moulded by the rules of the game that is also a feature of social media. And as an example here, I want to look at so-called cancel culture. Before I say anything more, I want to point out that there is obviously a lot of right-wing hysteria around this so-called practice of cancelling, when often what it amounts to is people being held accountable for abhorrent and harmful behaviour. And ultimately, this is nothing new. Okay, ostracism has always been a part of human society, it seems, as a regulatory measure. There might be better ways of dealing with conflict, but as an ultimate sanction, something like ostracizing or cancelling might be unavoidable. Okay, however we actually realise it in practice. But what I'm really interested in here is the particular phenomenon of cancelling on social media and how it too can be seen as a kind of augmented reality game. For examples of the kind of thing I'm talking about here, you could look at recent episodes involving sort of left-wing YouTubers, for example, Natalie Wynn and Lindsay Ellis. What happens often in these periods of, or kind of examples of people being cancelled, is tweets, forum posts, and other statements that a person has made are scrutinized for offending content. So reality is filtered through the rules of the game. The response to this offending content involves making forceful pronouncements about the person's guilt. So the rules of the game determine a certain behavior that individual players should take. And these individuals will cease their involvement in this, what often ends up being a sort of mob-like social media pylon only when the person in question apologizes or in a specific way or is removed from a certain position. So there are certain victory conditions in place that need to be met for the game to be won. At the root of it, this might not actually be anything particularly wrong with this. So in a recent episode of the ACFM podcast, which looked at the cosmic right and QAnon, one of the hosts commented that a lot of what we see here is actually mirrored in radical left circles. So, we build communities, and our engagement with the world is channeled and filtered through those communities and through the solidarity we have in those communities. We develop rules for things like decision making or ensuring that the spaces we inhabit are as safe as they possibly can be. And an augmented reality can actually, push us towards democratic and inclusive self-organization, rather than just the nefarious ends of something like QAnon. And I think something that's often missing from discussions of cancel culture is the role that social media plays in enabling this specific form of augmented reality game. So the rules that govern our behavior here and the filters through which reality is augmented are actually completely taken out of our control. They're decided by corporations, and they're decided by algorithms that we have no control over and often no knowledge of what's actually happening. So in a sense, then, our behavior is actually shaped and molded by the decisions of corporations and of these mainstream social media platforms. The game is something where the rules are set up for us, and we play it through the limited actions that are open to us on social media platforms. I think what we need to do then is try and focus on a new kind of social media architecture, one that would facilitate an augmented reality that privileges collective and consensual processes rather than corrosive behavior. How individual and collective behavior is shaped by the architecture of the platforms we use has to be at the forefront of our efforts. Do we need to then look at alternative platforms, build new platforms from the ground up with this in mind? And I want to suggest, to conclude, that if we do want to try and return to an optimism of the early days of social media, we need to start to think about how we can take control of the platforms through which our reality is augmented. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Thomas. That's grand. And thank you to all the other speakers too. We've now got about 25 minutes for questions. I've got some of my own. We've got a couple in the chat. If you've got a question to ask, just type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Can I start off by just sort of framing this in terms of that optimism, pessimism thing? Because that's a fairly sort of obvious dynamic in lots of what the four of you were saying. Micky, can I just start with you first of all? That in a sense your account was quite a playful one in a sense. I mean, it's certainly about the commodification of bodies and so on, but I had a sense that you didn't feel that work and play was quite as commodified as perhaps the other speakers did.
Well, if we think about the Olympic Games alone, like Olympic Games have always been very commercialized, So I'm not saying that, now at least people have a chance to kind of rebel against the system, like definitely not. In fact, I feel nowadays, if you think about athletes who could make money in the markets, they need to maintain their own images in addition to being extraordinary athletes. That if you are just good at your sport, that is not enough. You need to know how to use social media. So I'm not saying that I'm much more optimistic than others, but we are just talking about, Olympic Games. So in the book, since this is an edited book, we did talk about, different changes between work and play. So, for instance, well, especially for workers in high-tech industry, there is definitely a high demand for them to put in as many hours as humanly possible, but they are not framing it as exploitation. They framing it as because you love your work, because this is how you find meanings in life. So on the one hand, we can say, oh yeah, that's ideology, this is what the companies tell them. But it is also true that, especially in COVID, when a lot of people want to have a reboot of their career per se, there is a lot of kind of discourse just about, well, thinking about your own worth, thinking about your own values and how that will, fit into a much more flexible economy.
Okay.
So I don't really think, I'm optimistic about the entire thing. But I do see that, especially under COVID, the idea of branding, rethinking about your own values, even self-care at the beginning, that seems to be such a wonderful word. Nowadays self-care just becomes another digital economy. So I just feel, the entire social media, digital economy, they have been changing so fast that if you are not looking, in 2 months' time, there is this new phenomenon that you really struggle to understand, what it exactly is.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. No, that's helpful. I mean, it's something about the kind of the paradox in a sense, isn't it? Is that clearly people, many athletes, for example, are articulating themselves as a particular kind of commodity that might be sold or sponsored or whatever. But at the same time, that image of Tom Daley knitting or, a lesbian couple kissing is quite a sort of radical image in a way. Can I turn to Scott? And I'm going to pick on you, Scott, because you came across as probably the darkest and most pessimistic of our speakers. There's a question in the chat I want to aim at you, which was really about the sort of progressive forms of digital activism. I think Pete will probably pick up on this in a bit, but are there examples of what you think are impressive and progressive ways in which the algorithmic can be used to recenter power, let's say?
I mean, that's quite a tough question. I don't really have any sort of definitive answers on it. So sort of whatever comes next is sort of provisional and speculative. So don't hold me to it, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
I think that if we look sort of at American politics, their formal American politics, we see sort of how sort of the progressive left of the Democratic Party have been very good at using social media to present their talking points, make them part of the discourse, at least make them more competitive discourses in the United States. I think that's sort of a very positive development. These are sort of ideas that were sort of very much banished to the wilderness in the 80s and 90s, and they fluttered around in the 2000s, but they very much sort of come to the fore in the wake of 2008. For me, I think it's less about any one particular type of platform or any one particular type of strategy or the type of tactical engagement of digital marketers or organizers and the like, but rather sort of the type of policy framework and regulatory framework that organizes these platforms. I sometimes think that we miss that picture when it comes to how to sort of do the policy work of progressivism, if you will. I think, and again, I don't want to sort of talk too broadly over here, but I think sort of the left as sort of a movement, to the extent that there is a movement, is sort of very, very good at theoretical work, extraordinarily. You can see the books that have come out in the last 10 years are extraordinary, probably some of the best work that's been produced in the academy in modernity, right? I also think our activism is sort of very, very good too. You see, particularly, and again, because I sort of research the United States, Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, ancillary movements, extraordinarily strong, very, very powerful, able to generate and put people into the streets. And, because the types of injustices that they're talking about are very difficult to overturn and take time, we are starting to see results, and sort of more results may be forthcoming, but they're also countervailing powers. I think the thing that we're missing in the middle, though, is sort of the policy work. I don't think that we're very, very good at writing policy in order to regulate businesses well. So to me, I think that's something that needs a bit more work on. I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but those are the thoughts that your question sort of brought to my mind.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful, Scott, and particularly in the context of the Uber decision and so on. That presents all sorts of problems for thinking about the relationship between Labour and the state, doesn't it? In which, in many ways, these big platform corporations are much more effective at answering the social question to their own advantage.
Yeah, and they have the money. All types of sort of policy programs to sort of redistribute must be sort of pushed forward very, very aggressively, whether they be redistribution things like basic income or post distribution like sort of wealth policy, wealth taxes, or other type of targeted things in between. All those things need to be on the board to sort of just simply reduce the capital that capital has, right?
Yeah. Let me pitch the same question at Pete, because it's very apposite in terms of the topic of your book, Pete. So, just to rehearse the question again, what do you think is the most effective form of digital activism in the aftermath of COVID?
I personally think that the most effective is one that is very much based on, and I'm going to be very boring here, so I apologize and pretend it, but on 3 points. I think one is recognizing the ways in which global and local power dynamics are placed against each other. I think it's very interesting, like we're speaking in a university setting, but universities are in many ways, strong setting for how each university is exploitive in their own way, but based on universal principles of exploitation that they've been able to utilize. And better being able to discern some universal principles of domination. I think we have to have digital activism be one that is about collaborative knowledge sharing of what's actually at stake in our local context in terms of power dynamics, how these relate to global principles of domination, and what are different ways in which we can innovate and resist around that. I think the second point that I think is the move away from social media as merely a coping mechanism or resilience. And I think there was a question in chat about authenticity here, and I think there has been an individuation that you've seen around COVID about making a more resilient subject that's very much related to making a more resilient capitalism. And people like Brad Evans have spoken about this, for instance. But if you look at the two most recent kind of book, one book was Obama's book on his presidency, and the other was a movie that was on that won the Oscar, Nomadland, right? In their own ways, these are completely about the movement from capitalist realism that there's no alternative to capitalist resiliency, right? There's a sense which Obama is saying, oh, I wanted to change things, but I couldn't. And anyone who does should just kind of, stop being so idealist. And then there's another way in which we think about, look how resilient this person and heroic someone is like that. So I would say a huge part is, as Scott said, from a macro point of regulation, on a point of revolutionary culture to actually begin to see ourselves as parts of a class for ourselves that goes beyond just becoming resilient subjects in a world in which I saw a great meme where it's like, I never thought that I'd be in the middle of apocalypse and still have to come to work, right? And there's a reason that something like Walking Dead is such a popular show, because even in the midst of zombies, there's a sense of escapism that wouldn't it be great if everything fell apart and I didn't have to wake up at 9 o'clock tomorrow. And here we are in the kind of most, lenient apocalypse. We're in a pandemic in which, it's horrible, but it has death rates under 5%. And, if you look across, and yet we're still going to work, right? I think the third thing I would say is that we really need to combine localized, user-led cybernetics, as Thomas would work on, right? And bringing in old 1970s notions of centralized plannings with radical democratic forms of user-led horizontal governance with processes of public envisioning and innovative urban planning. And for instance, one of the dangers that you see, and I talked about it earlier with mutual aid, which is all of a sudden now become an interesting contradiction because it's a radical social practice that's also now a disciplining capitalist discourse, right? And the question then would be, well, how can we actually bring communities together so they could really publicly understand how their preferences and their data is being used? They could use that as a democratic planning technology for things like sustainable supply chains. And more than that, they could bring in to actual questions that they have and problems, different types of cooperative, anarchist, and socialist alternatives.
Yeah.
So those are the three things.
So when you talk about rematerializing, there's a sense, in which there's a fairly Marxist analysis underneath this, right? It's about, making the conditions of ownership and control much clearer.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that in a certain sense, our book was contributing to new materialism, but also directly questioning it, because in a sense, their critique of historical materialism, and one that has done it, was at a very macro level, and ultimately had a straw middle class reductionism. But what's really at stake is, what are the ways in which a materialist conditions of our lives that are based around the ways in which we are made as exploitable subjects of value help to organize our social existence? And if we have the possibility of experimenting with new ones, how could they combine together for a more strong, concrete reimagining of our realities?
Yeah. Okay, that's nice. Let me just segue to Thomas here, but use Dane Dodge's question about authenticity, because that's quite an interesting idea, and it kind of connects to some of the things that the other speakers have been saying. Thomas, do you think it's possible to be authentic on social media, or are you just becoming the product?
No. I think one of the interesting things is that there's in any sort of control system, always, there's always sort of the ingredients there for subverting it, and it never sort of completely defines you as a person, completely controls you as a person. There's always something that's outside of that. I think there's probably a very complicated Lacanian analysis of what's happening there that I couldn't begin to actually explain. But so I think there's possibilities for subversion and possibilities of resistance within these sort of mainstream social media platforms, even the way they work right now. And we can see that they do people use Twitter to help sort of mobilize for strikes and things like that. So there is clearly possibilities for other subjectivities within these platforms. I think the real question is, and this goes back to the sort of the earlier question, I think, is how do we identify what functions of social media are allowing us to do these things? So there's clearly good things in social media, right? It allows us to, do things like this. It allows us to stay in contact with people around the world, share a huge amount of information, learn a lot. You get a much wider array of, diversity of perspectives on the world. So there are all these positive things. I think what we need to do is sort of think about, well, what are the functionalities of the platforms that allow us to do that? Yeah. How can we replicate those useful functions, and how can we jettison the functions that are less useful?
You used that phrase, new media architecture, didn't you? Sort of, architecture is quite an interesting metaphor because, in its material sense, it defines where we can go and what walls we can get through, and and how high things are and all the rest of it. So presumably the implication there is that questions of the design of new digital technologies then become ones that could encourage, let me simplify enormously, but could encourage the demons in us or the angels in us, depending on how we articulate them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's the exact intention of using that sort of idea of architecture there. I mean, just to sort of parallel, one of the cybernetics scientists that I've studied, Gordon Pask. One of the things he dealt a lot of stuff around conversation and how conversation functions and what it means to have a sort of equal, non-hierarchical conversation. Okay. But one of the things he worked on was a thing called the Fun Palace, where it was a literal physical architecture that could be moved around and shaped and changed depending on what the people living in it actually wanted. So I don't think this was ever actually built. It was just a sort of idea. But it was, you could move walls, move floors around, change everything about the physical space, depending on the life that you wanted to live with the other people who are living there. And I think that's what we need for social media, something that makes it possible for people without, advanced degrees in programming and coding to actually engage in the design process, so that we can sort of build or alter platforms depending on exactly what it is we want from them and what we think is productive in terms of the kind of democratic lives that we want to lead.
That's quite nice. So your answer to Scott's social question could be the fun palace, which sounds
absolutely.
That sounds like a lovely answer. Scott, what do you think about that sort of idea of almost like a kind of moving the walls and the floors? The kind of the architecture of algorithms. Could you comment on how you think that might be made less problematic, should we say?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that sort of the book that I wrote tries to sort of speak about is sort of those options, those sort of pathways in front of us, those avenues, as it were, between sort of, as Thomas was saying, sort of more horizontal, more inclusive, more participatory decision-making about sort of the politics, societies, and technologies that sort of organize our lives, and the exact opposite of that, where it's very more opaque, it's top-down, it forecloses opportunities to even appeal, to discover what's organizing it, sort of property rights sort of foreclose that. And to me, I think that sort of becomes the key point: is how do we develop a property rights regime? I mean, we have sort of the answers, I think, in sort of making them operational. How do we have a property rights regime that allows that architecture to come about in the first place? One of the things I sort of see so often is sort of a lot of cooperative ventures that have very good agendas and very good track records, getting one or two board members in, making one or two choice hires, and then suddenly the cooperative venture is one in name only, and it just simply perpetuates other sort of capitalist modes of transaction and workplaces and so on and so forth. So you see how often sort of cooperative ventures can sort of fall to the agendas that they sort of set out to avoid. And so I think that if there's more, a work around actually implementing a property rights regime that is conducive to that fun palace, I think that has a greater chance of succeeding.
No, I think that's really interesting. And just to say, Pete Bloom's had to leave us now because his partner's teaching and they've only got one place to teach. So it's a fairly good example of the interrelationship between digital technologies and his office. So I just wanted to kind of spin another question, because we've still got 5 minutes or so, but to aim this one at Micky, because there's quite an interesting one here about the difference between two very familiar social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter. The sort of behind it is the idea that Facebook is somehow a more accountable platform, I suppose, because your friends, inverted commas, are mostly kind of people who you've accepted a friendship on, whilst Twitter is the kind of the sort of the anonymous pylon. Yeah, Micky, do you think there is a sort of a difference in the, how can we say, in the sort of the flavour of different media platforms depending on their architecture? Because this is an architectural question, isn't it?
Well, I would say I do agree with, let me see who wrote the question.
It was an anonymous attendee.
Oh, right.
Yes. Maybe their name.
Yeah, in a way, I agree, because you still need to have your network of friends, like on Facebook. And also, people always say that, like Twitter actually harms democracy in a way, because like you are only allowed X number of characters and you can never express your idea. It is so instant that people do not pause and think. So I think this point of view is valid, but at the same time, when I'm hearing previous conversation, I always want to go back to a point of at one point, Facebook was really seen as kind of, an alternative, so when you used to need to be a Harvard student and then you need to have a, .edu address, at that point, people thought it is still authentic. My question is, like, at what point do we begin to see a social media platform being evil? Like the same thing as Google. Google used to be seen as kind of a good force against Microsoft because, well, and also, Yahoo, because it doesn't take in advertising money. But of course, Google now is seen as an evil force, as much as, any other big companies. So to me, there is always a question of, yes, we can change the architect. You always have people coming out from Silicon Valley, coming up with like good ideas that, they believe would change the world, or they are not going to be commercialized. But at what points that would change? It is just about money? Is it about where bad people begin to use it? Is it when it becomes popular? So, I always want to identify the particular moment, not that I have come to a conclusion about it, but, I just, want to throw it out. What moment can we identify these technologies become less authentic, and become something that is more evil than than doing good in society?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, sort of two comments as we're sort of moving to something of a close. I mean, one is that in a way, and I suppose this was part of Scott's presentation, really, these technologies are now so ubiquitous, it's almost difficult to imagine our lives without them, isn't it? So they've become so much part of the everyday fabric of most people's experience in the global north. The second thing is it's to me still quite remarkable the extent to which astonishing corporate concentration and privilege has been naturalized now, to the extent that we have these billionaires who are probably the richest people who've ever lived. I would imagine that they make the Gilded Age of the 1920s in America look relatively paltry by comparison in terms of the piles of cash that these people now have access to, and consequently the ways in which they can shape public discourse. Sorry, that was me jumping on my soapbox, apologies. But with that, we are reaching a conclusion. So could I thank Scott, Micky, Thomas and Pete very much for their brief presentations, and for, I think, a very interesting and engaging discussion. Thanks very much to the audience for pitching up. And apologies to those people who did put questions in the chat, but we just didn't have time to get round to them. Just to remind you that details of how to order any of these books at 50% discount are available in the chat and will be sent to you after the event if you're registered, along with details of the next Bristol University Press seminar, COP26 and New Strategies for Climate Action on the 19th of October. So thanks ever so much for listening, and thanks to our speakers for talking, and we will say goodbye. Thank you. Bye-bye.